Today it's my great pleasure to chat with Marten Scheffer. He's a professor at Wageningen, if I pronounced that right, University
This is close.
in the Netherlands. It's it's actually a very important university in terms of agriculture. I looked it up on Wikipedia, and maybe he can talk a little bit about that, but his training, early training, was in ecology and math, and he studies complex systems and their adaptability. And he's made major contributions to modeling of complex systems, which many of our viewers and listeners may have heard about tipping points and relation to climate change and what's going on now, and some of the events, for example, with the permafrost, and maybe when that melts, we're going to get methane released and all this. But so I'll have him talk a little bit about his early work on ecosystems, but then I want him to, obviously, since this is a neuroscience podcast, recently he's got interested in applying some of his modeling methods and approaches to complex systems that are relevant to neuroscience, having to do with human brains and how they function or maybe don't function very well. So welcome, Marten. I'm looking forward to this. This is a little out of my, I'm a cell and molecular biologist, so I'm going to love this because I'm going to learn a lot.
Well, thanks for asking me. I'm really an outsider when it comes to studying the brain, but I'm definitely interested. And yeah, I've talked to a lot of brain people, so to say, and I'm learning.
Yeah. And can you talk about your early training at Utrecht?
Sure. I was studying biology and direction, first paleontology, like the old bones and dinosaurs, and then ecology. But what really grabbed me were some lessons about what was called bioinformatics or theoretical biology. None of us really understood very well what our teacher was trying to say. Us, it was a kind of peculiar old woman, very hippie-like, but it left our whole generation absolutely fascinated. And many of us now start understanding what she was saying. And this was about like the mathematical understanding of how patterns can arise, like the patterns in a zebra skin or the patterns on coral reefs, how cycles can emerge from interactions, what is chaos, how can it happen, and of course the tipping points that have been a recurrent theme in my later work. And so we were seeing the deep math of that, and it was all kind of cryptic, but we felt there was some magic there, and yeah, I made my career out of that, more or less.
So in that, you were exposed there to Alan Turing's theories?
Sure. Yeah, sure. Also Turing's theories, especially Turing once wrote this article asking how the morphology can arise from the question. So you have one cell and it has one set of information, then you have two of them, then you have four of them. So how does it start to that somebody says, okay, I'm going to be the head, you're going to be the tail, and so maybe now we know more about that, of course, but it fascinated him, and he was asking how that could emerge automatically, self-organized, so to say. And his theory about that is still relevant, and we know now it's relevant for how our fingers are forming parts, and also how patterns that we see in deserts or in the skin of animals arise. He was right.
Yeah,
I think it's one of his last.
I've I was trained in developmental neurobiology. So,
Okay.
so and I've kept that interest throughout my career, although I got involved in other things like neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, and so on. And maybe we can talk a little bit about your ideas on tipping points, during the lifetime of a person in their brain function. But let's first. So the university that you're at now, so I looked at it on the map. It's like southeast of Amsterdam, and it's there's like two rivers that run through there, and it looks like really good farmland. Is that right?
Yeah, it's fantastic farmland. I live along one of the rivers. We have an orchard here, and it's famous for the good farmland, for the good soils, and that's why they started the agricultural university there long ago, where my grandfather did his PhD,
Yeah.
and say on the chemistry of milk, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
So it is it's a university that is specialized in first in farming, then it's specialized in environmental sciences, and so it's a small specialized university and pretty rural, and the people there are pretty rural, and I feel quite at home there. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a kind
I
of
grew
no
up on
nonsense place.
I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. Actually, my ancestors are from Sweden, so southern Sweden. And
Okay.
yeah, so I'm well aware of, I'm really, thankful that I grew up there because it was really good environment. Of course, obviously you get interested in animals and nature when you grow up on a farm.
Inevitably, I guess it is what shapes our interest, right? Where you the
Yeah,
things you get in touch with so early on. Yeah.
yeah. So can you talk about your first studies of critical transitions in ecosystem? You were studying rivers there or streams in.
Yeah, lakes
Oh,
mainly.
lakes.
So
Okay.
my first job was with a state research institute, um, where they had the task of trying to improve water quality in Holland. And they found that most of the water had become really murky and eutrophied, full of um, phytoplankton, so the water is not transparent at all. You get toxic cyanobacteria and all kinds of problems. The fish die. So we were supposed to solve that, and then it turned out to be more difficult than we thought, because we knew the source of the problem was a pollution with too much nitrogen and phosphorus. So then we started solving that part of the problem. But then when we had solved that, the lakes wouldn't recover. They kind of stuck in this turbid state. And we were puzzled by that. And then we started finding out that you could give them a little shock therapy. You could take out the fish, most of the fish, and they would get clear. And then you could let the fish in again, and they would stay clear. So we were all puzzled by that, but I thought, this sounds a bit like some of those theories they taught me at university. So I started making little models, and we started testing it, and sure enough, those lakes had tipping points. They were healthy and clear, and when they were under too much stress, at some point they flipped. They became turbid, and then they would keep themselves turbid, so to say, by some feedback mechanisms that made it very difficult for them to recover. And once we understood that, and once we got the conditions recovered, reducing the pollution, and they were close perhaps to recover, then we could give them that little push, and it would work out. So this became one of the examples of that theory actually being relevant, because the theory itself, the mathematics, they were older, like from the 50s and the 60s, or even before that. But people didn't really believe they would apply to the real world. And this lake case, we pretty much figured it out, and we could do experiments to show it. So that became a kind of example that was then applied to other situations.
So can you talk about some of the terminology what is a tipping point? What's a basin of attraction? So in this lake system, you have like these two relatively stable states. Is that right? Clear or turbid?
Yeah, so we call those then alternative stable states, and they are both we would say resilient. When it's in one state, it's difficult to get it to the other state, and vice versa. So they have a basin of attraction, as we call it. If you push the system out, a big storm comes or something, it'll move a bit away, but it'll roll back to that same situation, so to say. It is an attractor. It's a self-stabilizing condition. So this this is then you can, for instance, a lake that is clear. It is kept clear because you have plants that grow underwater. They need clear water, otherwise they can't grow. But once they're there, they help keeping the water clear by filtering the water, and they host animals that filter the water, little water fleas and so. So you have those feedback mechanisms that if it's clear, you have this self-stabilizing situation. On the other hand, the turbid lake, then you lost the plants, so they're not helping you to make it clear. The wind can sweep the bottom of the lake, stir up the sediment. You get this big carp-like fish that forage in the sediment. The plants can't start growing because the water is turbid. There is no light, and the fish are disturbing the situation. So that the turbid one keeps itself clear, turbid also, so to say. Now, that is all understandable, but then the question is, how can you, in the end, lose your stability? How can you? How can you become fragile? How can the lake become fragile enough to tip from clear to turbid? Well, if you add more and more nutrients, then the little phytoplankton that makes the water turbid grows faster and faster. It becomes more and more difficult for the plants to maintain that clear state. So a term we use then is resilience. The resilience of the lake is becoming less and less and less. Eventually, resilience goes to zero, meaning you give it a little push. Only a little push is enough, like a windy day, and you move to the other state, so to say. And that is what we call the tipping point. The system has reached its tipping point. Now, the term tipping point is not a scientific term. It's not a mathematical term. It was popularized by Malcolm Gladwell with his book, The Tipping Point. But when you say the word tipping point, everybody understands more or less what you mean. And it became very popular, including in science, in climate science, for instance. If you ask more precise questions, there are different kinds of tipping points, and you get into more mathematical and less attractive terms. But the general idea of tipping points is captured very well by that word. So it's after the journalists came with it, the scientists adopted the term.
So ultimately, so these models seem to apply to pretty much any dynamic system that's been studied, complex system that's been studied, and then to understand, but at some point you still got to understand the details of how, and you talked about it in the case of the lakes, what's actually going on, and really do some kind of experiments or stress tests on the system to kind of test out, how close is it to a tipping point, or, I guess I'm getting towards kind of practical applications. When we as humans want to be able to control, hopefully in a good way, control some dynamic system or influence in a way that's beneficial.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So and systems differ a lot in what how you can research them. So I've been working for some years now with some psychologists and psychiatrists, and I've been telling them what we do with the lake to understand it. We do an experiment, and then we want to understand the part. So we take it apart. We make a little jar with only the algae and the water fleas, and then we have another jar with a water plant, and we analyze what happens, and the psychologist just laugh at me and say, "Well, yeah, you're a lucky man. You can do that with a leg. We can't do that with a brain. You know, we just can't pick out a certain thought or we can't take the dynamic elements apart and study them separately and put them together in a way that the whole makes sense." I don't know what you think about it.
You can know what information is going into that brain, you know, and then you can study the behavior, which is you know, an output. So you can control the input, and maybe it's a good time to start talking about okay, maybe this is belief traps, right? So you had a nice article that I've read a couple times in PNAS on, it's called Belief Traps, Tackling the Inertia of Harmful Beliefs. And so, you know, people can, and this is a big problem in the United States. I don't know if it's getting like this over where you're at, but, and we can talk about what the reasons are, you know, the internet and social media and you know, information bubbles and so on. But you know, before we went online, I was talking to you about your music, and you know, behind you up on the ceiling there, you have some string instruments, and all over that room, you're really an outstanding musician. So, and we talked about how I when I grew up, you know, my parents weren't involved in music at all. We didn't have any musical instruments in the house. So I have zero talent, and when I try to learn how to play the ukulele, it's not easy for me at this age. But when you're young, it is. And so kids grow up, and this is something I'm really worried about in terms of these belief traps, is that you tend to, whatever you learn a lot when you're young, and you learn it really easily, including beliefs. You know, so if you're raised in a family that has some, say, racist tendencies as a kid, you're probably more likely, you know, without a lot of more rational, thoughtful thinking, to continue in that kind of a basin of attraction, right? So I think from the neuroscience standpoint, if you think about it from a developmental neurobiology standpoint, you know, you started kind of interested in development, me too. This is an important thing. So, but why don't you talk about your belief trap paper and kind of how you went about studying this?
Yeah, I guess it's just that was just fascination, right? We share that fascination. That why is it that once people believe something, it's so difficult to change it, and sometimes there are beliefs like racist beliefs that you really would like to get rid of, but why is that so hard? And that really has been that paper is the end of kind of years of talking to people in different fields that have something to say about that. So that starts with the neuroscience and the encoding of memories through psychology confirmation bias, that once you believe something, you see evidence for it everywhere, and that makes you believe even stronger. To the social sciences, where people stress, well, yeah, you can say all that, but what is really important is that the things that the attitudes that people have make them part of a social group, and people need to be part of a social group, otherwise they get very unhappy. And if they feel lonely and not heard, and they may see sharing a belief or an attitude as a way, unconsciously, it may feel as a way to bond. And all those levels, of course, are operating. It's like a nested system where you, on a very neurological, simple level, you can see how those like self-reinforcing feedbacks work, and things get ingrained. But then there's also those other levels, also the level that we all strive for a coherent view of the world. So if then there is one thing that you maybe you don't want to believe it because it doesn't fit in the whole picture, and then you'll unconsciously do everything to avoid having to believe that. Say that's there is all kinds of like famous cool work by psychologists on that. But yeah, say you can understand it on many levels.
That's so that. Yeah, so that you get these self-amplifying feedback, so which is essentially confirmation bias in a way, right? I mean, you tend to believe things you want to believe, or that fit your initial kind of already ingrained view. And I was thinking this, and looking at, and you always have these nice illustrations with kind of a landscape, and then these kind of depressions in the landscape, which are the basins of attraction. In the case of belief traps, and you had a section on neuroscience in that paper, and so we have kind of an emotional component to our brain, these kind of subcortical, evolutionarily ancient brain regions, and then we have more intellectual, thoughtful brain regions like the prefrontal cortex, in which we make decisions. And so maybe these are like two basins of attraction, and if you get in a belief trap, then it becomes more of an emotional rather than a rational, thinking kind of basin. What does that make sense?
Yeah. No, definitely. Yeah, that's. I mean, this is a bit the thinking fast and slow idea of Daniel Kahneman, who got a Nobel Prize for that.
Martin, I just got his book. This is really interesting.
Okay.
Literally a week ago, I got his book.
It's wonderful. It's rare that a Nobel laureate writes a book that is such exciting reading for outsiders.
Yeah.
So basically, he and later others got this economics Nobel Prize to show that people are not as rational as they think. That's the short version of it. Most of our decisions, of course, are on in what they call fast thinking, the intuitive way of thinking, and then we do a bit of reasoning, and mostly that reasoning is like after this real decision has already been made. We paste a bit of of reasoning on it. Of course, as scientists, we're trained to work as well as possible with that reasoning and not be distracted. But of course, we also use our intuitions to choose which topic we want to study. I myself think always, I realize that the way you get into a haunch of an idea that later you study, it's intuition, and then we go with the scientific method, but but we have to work on something with that method. We have to. The scientific method is not so difficult. It's more difficult to find the right question in a way, and finding that right question also for scientists, of course, has to do with intuition. And it's interesting, if you read that book, you'll see that the two systems are a bit in competition with each other. Like if you're rationally thinking, you usually don't get a very new idea. You get a new idea when you're taking a shower or taking a walk or cooking potatoes. That's when your rational system is a bit relaxed, so to say. So they kind of compete for attention, and they're both very important in whatever life and whatever profession, including in science, I would say.
Yeah, the scientific method is mainly the main purpose is try to reduce bias, right? And ideally eliminated by having, for example, having someone who didn't do the experiment analyze in a blinded manner the data and that
Sure.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously, and then having others, try to repeat your experiments and see if they can.
Yeah, it reminds me of another economist that I've been talking to a lot, and his name is Ken Arrow. He passed away a few years ago, but he also got a Nobel Prize. He was the youngest ever to get a Nobel Prize in that field of economy. But he stayed young ever after. And when he was in his 90s, we would still meet with people, and he would just laugh and be very sharp and funny and humble. And of course, everybody wanted to know his secret. So he was happy to share ideas. And one of the ideas is, well, when you're not wrong as a scientist 2/3 of the time, you're not doing a very good job.
Yeah.
But when you're wrong, you better find out yourself, not only because it's more pleasant, but also because you learn from it. So it's like philosophizing that you have those two phases. You need to be open, and don't be afraid to be wrong in speculating. And then, of course, you have to become rigorous and apply the scientific method.
Yeah, some of my, over the years, many decades of research, some of our most important findings were findings where I would have a postdoc or graduate student do some experiment, based on some hypothesis I had, and they do the experiment, and the result was exact opposite of what I was thinking the result would be. And, and those are the experiments, of course, I had them repeat them many times. And so, for example, we found that when you have inflammation is thought of as a bad thing generally, right? Long-term inflammation. And there's these certain molecules called cytokines, pro-inflammatory cytokines, tumor necrosis factor. And so we did these experiments a long time ago, thinking that these cytokines are going to have bad effects on cultured neurons, make them more vulnerable to different kinds of stress and so on. And we found they actually protected the neurons. And then we went back and I thought, thinking, well, the receptors in these cytokines, they're around throughout our lifespan. Are they just sitting there waiting for some infection or something? So then we had evidence they're important in learning and memory and in brain development. So
that's fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, the experiments that work out differently than you predicted are of course the best. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in this, I think it was in your paper on belief traps, you point out that Bacon, Steve Pinker, and Spinoza, and by the way, Marten received the most prominent prize in the Netherlands, I understand, the Spinoza Prize. He was can you tell us a little bit about him? He was a philosopher, right?
Yeah, he was the son of political refugees, Jews from Spain coming to Holland. So, of course, political refugees bring beautiful things, and immigration brings beautiful things. I'm looking at my iPhone developed by the son of, I think it was Steve Jobs, the son of immigrants from Syria or something. I mean, there's endless examples of the beautiful effects of migration. Well, Spinoza is one of the philosophers that we are very proud of in Holland, thanks to the immigration. And he was his main point was he had several points, but don't be dogmatic. And he was in the process he was rethinking the phenomenon of God, and concluded that if you think everything is connected and one complex system in a way, then God is everything. And you say that there was he was a bit ahead of his time, I would say, and it brought him into deep trouble. So he was expelled from the Jewish community and assaulted.
Oh no! And you had a quote from him: "Beliefs are the main impediment to human progress." Or that's kind of the general.
Yeah, right. Because he was making the point that we should use our ratio. We should use the capacity we have to see whether a belief is whether it makes sense or not, and we should not hold on to it just because of we want to be good Christians, or we want to be part of this group. No, and you should keep rethinking everything and scrutinizing everything. And that's that of course that's we like to hear that as scientists. That's how we see the world. That's our job.
Okay, then and then you have some information on your thinking on how to tackle the inertia of harmful beliefs. You want to say anything about that?
So the first thing you would think when somebody is a racist or so, or whatever, the elections have been stolen, is to provide counter evidence. And then in general that doesn't really work, and then we are surprised because we think this is all rational. Right. It's not as simple as that. So there's different levels that you can think of this. Counter evidence does help, but it needs to it depends who is bringing it, and it needs to be repeated, and so. But there is another level that I'm really interested in, and that is how the question of what determines whether we involve our rational thinking or we just go with our gut feeling. And there is a lot of work from the neurobiological level to the psychological level showing that stress makes a lot of difference. If we are stressed out, tired and stressed out, we don't do very well thinking rationally. We go with quick connections. Yes. And that makes it very difficult to kind of reprogram, to abandon a belief. So in a society where people are stressed out, and that's a society where people are maybe losing their job, or feeling not feeling valued for what they do, or feel unsafe. In those situations, you more easily get into this black and white thinking, and more easily you're prone to this confirmation bias, and maybe because of the feelings of social isolation, loneliness, not feeling valued, you crave being part of a group, and such groups may organize around conspiracy theories or so. So it's like at a certain level, you can say that a society where people are stressed out for different reasons is more likely to produce rigid beliefs, and those can be socially problematic rigid beliefs, like the election has been stolen, or racist beliefs. But they also include the beliefs that are the fundament of some of the psychiatrical disorders that we know, like belief I'm worthless, or delusions. And indeed, historically, periods with lots of stress seem to see more of this kind of psychiatric problems also.
And I think that this, this fast and slow thinking is very important, because it seems like, with the information age, there's less slow thinking. So I think a slow thinking is sitting quietly in a room, thinking about something over periods of hours, right? Which is, you and I do that a lot, right? But in modern society, a lot of people don't do that. Young kids definitely aren't doing that. They're, now we have things like TikTok, where it's 1 minute, 1 minute this, and then it's the next thing coming at them. There's always something coming in. If there's always something coming in, then you don't have time to really think rationally about things and connect things and put things in perspective. So I think and so how the heck do we solve that problem, right? Because it's kind of in motion already.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Some years ago, they found a new manuscript of a friend of Newton describing what happened with the famous apple incident, when he saw an apple falling, and it describes that it was like a lazy afternoon. They had afternoon tea, and nobody was doing nothing, and he was sitting under this tree, having nothing to do, and then he sees this apple fall. And he watches it, and then he starts thinking, why does that thing fall down and not up? And well, the rest is history. But what if Newton would have a smartphone? He would already have been looking at TikTok and not paying any attention to that apple, and have that slow thinking going on. So, yeah, that definitely
the environment, our environment is changing much more rapidly than we evolved to be able to process. And that's another thing that I'm concerned about. Is so a lot of kids now, they grow up in cities, or even if, whatever, suburbs, and they're not out in nature very much. So, we evolved walking through the woods or the savannah or whatever, right? And I think the slow thinking aspects of human during evolution is probably that part of the brain that can do the slow thinking is the most important. And so we grew up like in these hunter-gatherer societies, say 100 people, and so there's some social interactions, but a lot of the day is spent being able to have time to think about, is there anything I can do to make it easier to kill an animal? Oh, well, yeah, I can make a spear, or I can, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think
no, definitely our brain is definitely not made for the way we're living, of course. But and yeah, it may be a sideline, but this week, I think yesterday, came out, I think, an article in some neuroscience journal showing that rhesus monkeys can do deliberate thinking. They had a smart experiment where they had to pack a backpack, and they caused them all kind of difficulties, and they were very rational. So we're not the only ones doing deliberate thinking out there, apparently. And yes, we grew up in this very different situation, and people have written a lot about like what is called the biggest mistake in human history. That we abandoned hunter gathering, and we started living in cities and doing agriculture, eating a very monotonous diet, having a very monotonous life. Our brain shrinking in the event, and so that's pretty recent, of course. That's only what is it? I don't know, 10,000
yeah, since
years
the
or so.
agricultural revolution.
Yeah. So and and then we had to find all kinds of ways of still making life work, right? In cities and empires and nations, and that didn't go all that smoothly. So we got some thinking, and we got some religion going on, the Bible and the Quran. And so basically, people argue that those are kind of efforts to try to make things work in a setting that's not made, that we're not really made for.
Yeah.
So there is a lot about that, about the institutions we developed to make society work, but not so much about the conditions for our brain to work. So I think that's a really important and very interesting point that you mentioned. Yeah.
The hunter-gatherer societies are more egalitarian. They're more democracies, essentially, right? I mean, now there's these, well, for example, thinking about your work and where I'm at, are we getting towards a tipping point in our democracy? And historically, democracies don't last very long.
No, states don't last very long. We have a manuscript now under revision on the longevity of states, and we look at many hundreds throughout history, and on average, they live a couple of 100 years, but their risk of being terminated increases as they age, which is the same as happens to humans. Our risk also increases with age. With humans, it goes exponentially. The risk increases exponentially, so we all end up more or less the same age. But with society, it's a different hazard curve, so to say, over time. But still, they become fragile as they age. That is the take-home message. And there's many things happening there, and that you can imagine contributing to that fragility. One is building up inequality. The other is maybe over exploiting the resources. There is a bunch of things that seem to be going on. Again, that's not something we can really experiment on very easily. We can't just put them in a test tube and replicate and try. But there is quite a bit of evidence compiling that there is some tendencies that over time make states more fragile.
Yeah. You mentioned inequality, and you've looked at that too, right? And there's some in your work and probably others there, it's evident like seems to be a role for chance, that if you have large populations, that just by chance there's going to develop a lot of inequality.
That's right. So if you look at the mathematics of it, if you then you see that it has a tendency to emerge as soon as luck or bad luck becomes a multiplier of what you already have. So if you have $1,000 and you gain 10% or you lose 10%, if it works like that, in the end, a few people will just become very rich. And And you can just do that as a gambling game with throwing a dice with a group, and in the end you'll see that one person almost has all the money without that person being better at rolling dice.
Yeah.
Of course, in reality, that's only part of what happens. In reality, it's also true that if you get richer, you're also better able to roll the dice. You're better able to defend what you have. But on a very basic level, there is already a chance that tends to cause this inequality. And you see that societies have always tried to reduce that inequality. And you also find that in whatever, also in the Quran and the Bible, you have to, it's all about fairness and trying to avoid that. So we develop institutions, and you can think of taxation, and so to try to reduce that inequality, but it tends to grow at the same time. And of course, if you look at a more realistic picture of how society works, the more wealth you get, the more power you have to also set the rules or affect the rules in a way. So there is a tendency for that to go to tumble wrong, so to say, and have all the power, all the wealth in the hands of a few, and that doesn't work very well, because then people feel frustrated and they don't like it anymore, and in the end it is something that is destabilizing the situation.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very short version, because there is a lot of information. How is unfairness seen? How is it seen in the media? How is it projected in newspapers, in social media? How is the spinning of the story going on? So it's a complicated story, but in general, wealth concentration tends to corrupt politics, and it's a danger for democracy. And that was already known for a long time.
Yeah. Well, that's a big problem here. Essentially, the big corporations run things. Well, we've seen this with climate change, right, and the fossil fuels industry, but there's so many other examples. You're mentioning luck, and that got me thinking. So I don't know if you can see behind me here.
Yes, I'm wondering what it is.
Horse bits.
Okay, yeah.
And so my father, my grandfather, and me and my brother trained and raced harness horses, trotters and pacers that pulled a cart like this.
Okay, yeah.
Actually, my grandfather's, I can't remember which horse. He's in one of these horses. That's like in the 1950s. But so at one point, I was thinking about doing this for a living. And we just did it. We lived on a farm. My father was actually an attorney, the district attorney, where we lived, prosecuting attorney. And he just did it for a hobby. We had a training track on the farm, and we'd race at, we call it county fairs. Sometimes if we had a pretty good horse, we'd go to one of the big tracks down in Kentucky. But my father kind of discouraged me from doing this, because essentially the way it is you have to get really lucky and get a good horse and make a lot of money early on. Otherwise, you're going to be poor.
Right.
So all the rich people buy the best yearling horses, the ones that are most likely to be good, and then they get more powerful, and you have these other people scraping by. So
yeah. Then you're in a kind of poverty trap, as they say. Well, if you have nothing, you have to live from day to day, and you can't invest in business or in setting something up. That's what I call the poverty trap. It's very difficult to get out. You need to have something to start. So that's how they came with the microcredit then. So, but once you're out, then you can start building up, and
well, the government, the systems, completely capitalist system would seem to exacerbate inequality compared to more social, you know. So for example, where you're at in the countries, Sweden, Denmark, around there, people pay a high percentage of taxes, but then that taxes are used for, you know, you have universal health care. Actually, we're getting off topic a little bit. So we went to the Netherlands once, me, my wife, my son and daughter. My daughter was 3 years old, and I went to a meeting in Groningen, and we stayed in some kind of nice little house, actually, out in the country. Rode bikes around there and stuff. But my daughter accidentally slipped and hit her head on the frame of a bed and cut her head. And so finally, you know, we didn't speak any Dutch, and so anyway, finally we were able to get a cab and take her to the emergency room, and, you know, very efficient health care, and they fixed her up, and then they said, this is all free and don't worry about it.
Yeah.
You know, that
isn't that nice?
Yeah. So here it's not that way. The whole healthcare system here is based on profit. It's profit driven, and it's caused a lot of problems. Okay, but anyway, another cause of inequality, in that case, in healthcare. You did a couple studies where you analyzed language over whatever, more than 100 years, and I guess millions of books. You know, you can do this because of the internet. And so you looked at changes in language, and you looked at something called cognitive distortions. Could you talk briefly about those?
Right. Yeah. I got fascinated by the tool of being able to analyze language automatically now. It's pretty amazing, and it's all like free access. You can look at the frequency of a word over time, and you can also look at how the meaning of that word has changed relative to other words. So that's all computational techniques. So we have, of course, access to like databases of social media, like Twitter, and so that you can analyze the text. But also, indeed, millions of books have been analyzed, and we thought, let's mine that and see if we can find some interesting patterns there, starting 1850, so industrial revolution at times, and ending up now. And I was fascinated by the question of whether the post-truth society is something recent, right? Whether the fact that the idea that, well, it doesn't matter whether you prove something right or wrong, you can you get away with anything. It's all about feelings, and this has, of course, kind of exploded a bit in recent years, especially with Trump's presidency. But then, so we thought, let's look a bit back in time, and we were first I was looking words that express like human emotion things like love, fear, hate, guts, versus words that have more to do with rationality, like percentage, conclusion, committee, result. Look a bit, and sure enough, we found some interesting patterns. But then we thought it was like maybe that would be a bit cherry picking. So we then looked at just the most abundant words, a lot of words, hundreds of words, how they evolved over time, and whether you just ask one of those statistical approaches like principal component analysis or so. Do you see a pattern? And yes, there was a pattern. And guess what? That pattern coincided with the things that we had found cherry picking. And what you basically see is that indicators of rationality, of interest for rationality, because you see them a lot in books, so people are apparently interested in it. Those increased from 1850 till about 1980. There was an increased appreciation for results, for conclusions, for that kind of things. And there is literature about that. They call it the disenchantment of the world, because it goes at the cost of things like feeling, intuition, emotion, brother, sister, gut kind of thing. They become less abundant. So this is a well-known phenomenon, and you can perhaps understand it from a society that was developing more technique, more science, and it all seemed to work very well. But then what is interesting, of course, is that this trend reversed starting 1980 and becoming much more rapid after 2000, and then more rapid even after the rise of the social media, like 2013. And we're back to the level of 150 years ago in terms of restoring, so to say, the balance in which interest in emotions reflected by words, by human experience is very high again, and that has gone at the kind of interest in indicators of rational thinking and societal organization, so to say.
Yeah, because we've noticed this most recently here. So it seems like there's a lot of people, so we have podcasts and like I'm doing now, and a lot of the news, like the cable news, a lot of it's just mainly opinion rather than information or evidence. And people seem to get attracted to personalities rather than necessarily the qualifications or knowledge base of the person who's giving their opinion. And then they fall into this trap to follow them. So I think there's problem in people actually having trouble or not realizing that they're looking at sources of information that are not reliable, or are at least not the whole story. So I don't know if this is part of the reduction in rationality.
Yeah, I hope that it's a kind of a transitional problem. What you see with media changing, at least the social media and the way the news works, and so is that it's affecting our generation more than the kids. The kids seem to be able to figure it out. So if you, for instance, see, they did research on how many people retweet false news, and it's mainly people older than 60 years old. And the 50, the kids figure it out pretty fast. So I think things went a bit fast for us, and for a generation, it's they read things completely wrongly, and it's a big problem. I think actually that will go away, but we are kind of taken by surprise by the new playing field, so to say.
Okay, well, maybe that's a optimist. That's good. You made me think of a Bob Dylan song, "Times They Are Changing," right?
That's right.
Get out of the way if you can't lend a hand. So maybe we just need to get out of the way.
Yeah, maybe. Well, we keep ourselves entertained with some nice, nice. But no, I think we have a lot of. There is a thing such as wisdom, so to say.
No, I know.
We have things to pass along, but when it comes to kind of this information world changing, you see that that whole generation, and not everyone equally. I guess we are. we may yeah, not everyone equally, but the elderly people are more vulnerable to this kind of tricky change in the information world.
Yeah. Well, maybe that makes sense. Maybe that does make sense. Yeah, I guess I have noticed that, particularly in my son. He's really good at picking out things that are not wrong, or well, he's actually a scientist. So
Right, yeah.
But
So,
yeah, let's see. So at one point you mentioned aging. Now, have you looked specifically at aging doing modeling? Because there are definitely tipping points with any particular disease, and one of your articles on this, on how you, okay, let's talk about prediction. How can one get at predicting when a critical change is going to occur? Are there any, you have to be measuring something, right, in the system, measuring something. Are there any like warning signs of a tipping point's coming?
yeah, right. That's yeah, that touches upon something you mentioned at the start. Is yeah, can we figure out how systems work in all
Yeah.
detail? And but even if not, is there some? Are there kind of generic things that tell us something about whether a system might be approaching a tipping point? So that's one of the questions we've worked on, and the answer, in a way, is that we can never predict tipping points, because the actual tipping event always has something stochastic to it. There is something triggering it, so to say. But we can, in many cases, we can measure something underlying, and that's resilience. How well is the system able to recover when it is being perturbed? So when resilience becomes smaller and smaller, in the end, resilience is nil, and the tiniest thing can cause a tipping point, so to say. And yes, there are indicators of that. Basically, if you study the recovery of systems and they recover quickly, it's a good sign. When they recover more slowly, it's a bad sign. And you can think of well, let's first take an example. If you get something bad happening in your life, whatever, a bird shitting on your head, small thing, and it gets you in a bad mood, but then you stay in a bad mood, and the next day you're still in a bad mood, it's not a very good sign. Right. If you forget about it very quickly and 5 minutes later you're happy again, it's a good sign. Well, this is a silly example, but it could be like a nasty outcome, a nasty event, right. Somebody passing away, or somebody being nasty to you. If you recover from that quickly, it's a good sign. If it sticks on you for days, it's not such a good sign. But that's just one example. Actually, if you perturb a lake, if it's a bad weather event and it's quickly clean again, it's a good sign. If you can continue and sometimes you can't do the experiment, but you can just follow the little fluctuations in time of a system, and you can think of those fluctuations like the fluctuations in your mood being the result in part of some internal things, like you're getting hungry or sleepy or so, but in part by things that happen to you. You have a nice conversation, you have a bad conversation, your paper gets rejected by a journal, or it gets accepted. All those little things cause a little fluctuation in your mood. And when that fluctuation goes like rapidly, and you have a little autocorrelation, little memory, so to say, it's an indicator that you have a resilient mood in this case. If this starts to recover more slowly, you see more, it's increasing, it's decreasing, you have less you have more memory, it's slowing. That's an indicator of low resilience. And that sounds like a bit like abstract and perhaps a wishful thinking, but actually there is a lot of mathematics behind that and how it relates to tipping points. And then there is lots of applications. We've shown that you can detect resilience of rainforest from time series of how green the forest is seen from a satellite. We've shown that ancient civilizations, before they collapsed, started showing those signals of what we call critical slowing down. And we've shown for people that indeed a slowness of those fluctuations in the mood are a predictor of later getting a full-blown clinical depression. So yes, those are pretty generic things, and that's fascinating. As a scientist, that's what really that's very good for my mood when I find something and say, well, there are some generalities, and look at that. It's like crossover between those very different systems. That's just so cool, and that's good for my mood as a scientist.
Well, we thankfully we evolved to, when we have some perturbation and overcome it, we're stronger, more resilient for having been subjected to that stress. I've done a lot of work on this, on something called hormesis, or
Right.
adaptive stress responses. And you mentioned not getting a paper accepted. I remember when I was a graduate student, you may had the same experience, and you spend all this time working on your first paper and you think it's like the greatest thing in the world, and you submit it and you get the comments back and you get criticisms, and you feel really bad for days, maybe weeks, and then, but as time goes on, that happens again, and you say, oh, this is the way it is. Their comments are useful. I'll take their comments and maybe do more experiments, or
Yeah.
other suggestions. So, but yeah, so systems
Sure.
are very resilient, and yeah.
Sure, that's very important. At least I guess you and I are resilient because we had that mechanism and it made us stronger. There is perhaps also ones that after that experience dropped out, right? So in our case, we went into the kind of positive circle, and we became pretty.
One of my worst experiences was, so I grew up on a farm, raced horses, right? So I wanted to be a veterinarian. And so I went pre-veterinary medicine at the university I went to. And back then you could apply for veterinary medicine school after 2 years, or in your second year of undergraduate work. So I applied and didn't get accepted. And so that was a big blow. And then, but in the meantime, I got interested in science and stuff. And actually, in a way, I'm glad I didn't become a veterinarian, because I think I've enjoyed being a scientist in the long run.
That's right.
Much more.
I had a similar experience. I applied for being a bird counter, and they refused. I thought, why? I'm a good bird spotter and I can count, but I didn't think I was good for that. In the hindsight, I'm happy, I got another job and it got me all into this work on lakes and so, and that was much better.
Yeah.
There is a bit of luck involved too.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's a really important point, that resilience, and that's pretty generic, I think. Resilience is an adaptive feature, and it builds up by being challenged in a way, and when not challenged, it fades away because it's not it has a cost. It has a cost, and this is probably for another interview, but you see this also for ecosystems. You see it for societal things. So resilience is an adaptive thing, and you become hardy when challenged. That's certainly part of the story. On the other hand, when you age, there is also certain parts that you can't really do much about. So you can work on it. You can keep challenging, and that's nowadays we think that's good. In the past, the idea was that old people should be kept out of the wind and don't make them walk too much, and so now we understand that's actually not true, and you need to keep challenging.
It used to be when someone had a heart attack, the standard of care was, they should not exert themselves. You don't want to put stress on your heart. And it turns out, well, part of the reason they had the heart attack is because maybe for a lot of people, they're sedentary and, hadn't been put any stress. And so there was no adaptation built in. But now the standard of care is get the people moving and get them in some exercise program. Same thing with pregnant women, so, and that's something I'm a little worried about. I've done some published paper on autism. There's increased risk of autism in children that are born to a mother with obesity or type 2 diabetes. And, so again, it's kind of the same thing that standard of care used to be, well, if you're pregnant, you need to maybe take in more calories because the baby needs, you need energy for the baby, and don't overexert yourself. But then if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, these hunter-gatherer women, they're right after the baby's born, the baby's latched onto them and they're out foraging for, so actually pregnant women they need to be fit when they're pregnant.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
And okay, well, I think we've covered a lot. I'm going to put in the discussion or the description section, I'll put in links to some of your PDFs of your various articles, your early Nature articles that really, I think, put your work in the spotlight, and how people working on ecosystems and climate think about what they're doing in the context of these overarching concepts that seem to be kind of informative of what to look for, and how maybe even to perturb the system to kind of test its stability or level of instability. And then I'll put in some of these more recent PNS papers where you've got into issues of problems in society, belief traps, inequality, and so on. But I wasn't, until I did this podcast and kind of looked through things I want to talk about and started looking into literature, I wasn't aware of these. I do have the, was it Lewin's book, Complexity? There's a book called Complexity, that one? It's a kind of, I think, a famous book. There may be multiple books by now, but this is an older one.
Okay. Yeah, it's like this whole like field of thinking has gone under different flags, but nowadays you'll hear the term complexity a lot for that. The Santa Fe Institute working on that, for instance.
This is, I don't know if you can see that. Roger
Oh,
Lewin?
yeah, that's right. That's an older, yeah, nice, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so I guess
this whole systems thinking and relating the emergent behavior of complex systems to some underlying rules that really got big in the 70s, 60s, 70s. the fundamental mathematics earlier, but that was a very productive period in thinking about cybernetics, about complex systems and how they stay intact, and so and how they evolve complex adaptive systems.
And as we mentioned, economics has become very important there. We had a couple, not really large, but fairly large banks collapse, and part of the reason was the previous administration had, since the big problem back in 2008 here, the recession, they put in place these stress tests on the financial institution, and then I guess when Trump came in, that went away. There was no more stress testing, so
right,
there was no.
It started with the big financial crisis, with the fall of the Lehman Brothers, and then they came with the stress test. But what is interesting is that weeks before the fall of the Lehman Brothers, there was a paper published by an ecologist, American ecologist, Simon Levin, and a banker called Ecology for Bankers. And they were warning that this whole connected system could be very fragile, and that in ecology we'd done experiments and learned about how to probe that, and the ink was barely dry, and the Lehman Brothers fell, and we got this worldwide financial system collapse. So that's interesting in terms of cross systems thinking.
That's fascinating work. It's very nice to meet you in person, if only virtually. And I look forward to communicating in the future.
Sure, same here. Thanks for having me in the podcast.
Okay, Martin. Bye.
Okay, bye, Matt. Bye.